Mehmet. For 3 months now, I have been the night guard at that old cemetery, where even the winds drifting away from the city's roar hesitate to visit. When people heard that I had accepted this job, that familiar expression appeared on their faces. Fear mixed with pity. "What are you doing in a cemetery at night, Mime? What do you hope to find among the dead?" they said. I had no answer to give them, because I liked silence, or rather, that vast, devouring emptiness. I mistook for silence. I believed loneliness protected me from the world, like a suit of armor, but I was wrong. Loneliness was not armor, it was a hunting ground. The cemetery stood at the northern exit of the city, a monument of abandonment hidden among rotting pine trees and enormous cypresses. Even during the day, the sun could not fully penetrate this place. As the light filtered through the branches, it seemed to become tainted, turning into a pale gray before falling onto the soil. Most of the gravestones had long ceased to be monuments, transformed into shapeless rocks under nature's relentless assault. Moss had erased the names of the dead one by one, swallowing their dates. Some gravestones had tilted so much due to the sinking earth beneath them that it looked as if those underground were craning their ears to listen to the outside world. When the sun withdrew beneath the horizon, the cemetery did not merely sink into darkness. It seemed to change shape. At night, this place evolved into a different dimension, where the laws of physics loosened their grip. When moonlight struck the marble stones, those lifeless blocks seemed to burst from the soil like teeth, each trembling as if it wanted to tell its own story. The sound the wind made as it moved through the branches was not just a natural phenomenon. It was a well from thousands of throats, impossible to put into words. After midnight, the wind would begin to shake the cemetery's rusted iron gate. That creaking sound would travel through my eardrums like a fine needle. The shrill screech of iron scraping against iron sounded like a scream being released slowly. Each being, the dry branches of the trees clashing together produced rustling noises like skeletal fingers playing violins, while the dried leaves on the ground crackled as dot if crushed beneath invisible feet. Everything was whispering. Everything was alive. One night, as the clock was nearing 2, I was sitting in my guard hut, sipping my tea. The window of the hut was fogged over. I was standing on that thin boundary between the cold outside and the mild warmth inside. Suddenly, I heard a deep hum climbing up from beneath the hut's floor. At first, I thought it was the sound of a lorry coming from far away, but the sound deepened, intensified. This was not an engine. It was like the roar of a gigantic creature, breathing in its sleep. A vibration rising from kilometers beneath the earth. Primera stood up. The sound of my boots on the concrete floor was nothing more than a faint tapping beside that hum. The moment I opened the door, the cemetery's icy air struck my face like a slap. The air was so dense that I felt what I was drawing into my lungs was not oxygen, but a dusty sorrow. I switched on my torch, but instead of piercing the pitch darkness, the light seemed to be swallowed by it. The beam trembled, and I could not see where the path ended. I took my steps slowly, as if afraid of injuring the ground itself. As I passed each gravestone, I felt a burning sensation along my back. Ik knew dozens. Hundreds of eyes were gathering on the nape of my neck. All at once, my heart was like a wild bird pounding against my ribcage. When I reached the source of the sound, the oldest section of the cemetery known as the stopped beside a grave. The stone had become almost completely smooth under the effects of time and wind. No name, no date of birth, just a pitch-black void. At that moment, I heard the voice echoing directly inside my ears, in the deepest folds of my brain. It was not just a name. It was an icy whisper carrying reproach. longing, and a summons all at once. Hearing my own name sounded alien and terrifying, as if it had slipped from the lips of the dead. "You're imagining things," I whispered to myself, "from exhaustion, from hunger, from loneliness." My logic was crumbling like a collapsing wall, but my soul knew the truth. The voice came again, this time not from within the wind, but seeping directly from the cracks of the nameless grave before me. "Mehmet, we are here. All of us are here." The strength drained from my knees. I grabbed another gravestone beside me to keep from collapsing. The stone was warm, despite the freezing air outside. No, this was not a normal warmth. It was the unsettling heat of a fevered forehead. When I placed my hand on the stone, I felt a pulse beneath my fingertips. The soil beneath the stone rose and fell slightly, as if a gigantic lung were taking slow, deep breaths. From that moment on, silence died completely. From every corner of the cemetery, from every crack, different sounds began to rise. A woman's sobbing, a man's anger-filled muttering, an old person's moan. Thousands of whispers merged into a massive choir. All of them were shouting a single word. My name. Mehmet. Mehmet. I covered my ears with my hands and squeezed my eyes shut. But the voices were not coming from outside. They were coursing through my blood, echoing in my bones. My pulse had accelerated so much that every beat exploded in my head like a sledgehammer. I wanted to scream, "Go away, leave me alone." But my throat was not hid shut. When I opened my eyes, I realized the world was no longer the place I knew. My torch could not even illuminate the dust particles hanging in the air. The beam struck some invisible wall and bounced back, covering only a few centimeters ahead with a curtain of dark mist. The ground beneath my feet rippled rhythmically with that pulse I had felt earlier. Every step felt like the desperate thrashing of an animal sinking into a swamp. "I need to get out of here," I muttered. But instead of escaping, my voice echoed inside my own throat and buried itself within me. My hut was only 100 meters away. On a normal night, it was a 10-second walk. Now it looked as distant as the horizon. I started running, the dusty sorrow in my lungs sharpened with every breath. But something was wrong. Despite my legs moving with all their strength, the gravestones I passed remained the same. Hadn't I just passed that broken marble angel on my right? Was I seeing that massive, rusted iron family tomb with railings on my left for the third time? The cemetery was folding in on itself like a living organism, stretching the paths and hiding the exits. With every step I took, the distance grew instead of shrinking. When I looked back, I saw that the city lights, where the gate should have been, had vanished completely. The city had been erased from this world. Now, there was only me, the stones, and those endless whispers. When I stopped to catch my breath, I dropped to my knees in front of a gravestone. The inscriptions on it suddenly began to glow. An image leaked from the Moscovit's surface, as if the stone were vomiting out the memory it had imprisoned. I saw a man who had died in the 1940s, drawing his final breath. I heard the rattle in his throat, felt the last hope he reached for but could not grasp. In the grave beside it, a child's unfinished smile appeared. All of their pain passed through my body like a cold draft. The cemetery did not merely store the dead. It held their unfinished business, their fears, and their final moments, like poison within itself. And now that poison was trying to seep into me. I pulled myself together and tried to run again. But this time, the stones began to move. No, they were not changing places. They were stretching upward from beneath the soil, forming massive walls. New graves were appearing directly in my path. The earth smelled freshly, dug wet, raw, and okayed. I saw small, pale hands breaking through the soil at my feet. When that child's voice I had heard earlier repeated, "Shall we play a game?" Its laughter echoed directly behind my neck this time. When I turned around, there was no one there. But right behind my boots, in the wet soil, were tiny, fresh handprints. They were following me, step by step, breath by breath. I looked at the watch on my wrist. The minute and hour hands were spinning at an impossible speed. Seconds chased minutes, minutes chased hours, yet the sky remained pitch black. Time had stopped flowing linearly here, in a single second. I felt as old as 1,000 years. In the next moment, as helpless as a baby not yet born. Just then, I saw that light again, rising from the most secluded corner of the cemetery, from the place where the faceless shadow dwelled. The light slithered towards me between the graves like a snake. Every stone it touched cracked. Every tree shed its leaves and withered. The light did not represent death. It represented annihilation. The whispers had turned into screams. I felt a thin ache seeped from inside my ears. When I touched them, I realized it was warm blood. The intensity of the sound had reached a level that felt as if it would tear my eardrums apart. Mehmet. Look at us, Mehmet. Remember us. They were no longer just saying my name. They wanted something from me. They wanted me to share their forgotten state, to wander this endless labyrinth with them. I stopped for a moment. If I couldn't escape, this soil would swallow me too. The cold draft coming from behind raised the hairs on my neck. At last, the door opened with a loud creak, without even a guard, and I threw myself inside. My throat slamming it shut glass back. The trembling in my legs was no longer from the reassuring sound I had ever heard, but from the collapse of my body's survival instinct. The faceless shadow was approaching slowly with that sickly light I had left behind. I could feel it wasn't running. It was simply existing. And with every step it took, the world bent around it to make way. With one final effort, a lunge towards the guard hut, standing crookedly in the center of the cemetery. My hands were shaking when I reached the door. Getting the key into the lock was impossible. The cold draft coming from behind raised the hairs on my neck. At last, the door opened with a loud creak, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut with my back. The click of the lock turning was the most reassuring sound I had ever heard. Or so I thought. The inside of the hut was not the way I had left it. The tea glass on my desk was still there, but the tea inside had dried as if it had been waiting for years, leaving a black stain at the bottom. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Its pages were yellowed, and the dates looked as if they had been written, not with ink, but with blood. Yet I had entered this hut only 10 minutes ago. The minute Mehmet. Whispers outside began striking the walls of the hut. The wooden structure creaked as if being squeezed by a gigantic hand. I reached for the radio on the desk. Maybe I could reach the city. Maybe someone. When I pressed the transmitter, I expected to hear only static, but the voice that came from the other side froze my marrow. "Your shift is over, Mehmet. Why are you still here?" It was my voice, my intonation, my emphasis, but it sounded much older, much more exhausted. I threw the radio onto the desk. The drawer of the desk was slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it. Inside was an old, leather-bound notebook with burnt edges that I was certain had not been there before. When I picked it up, the coldness of its cover seeped into my fingers. I opened the first page, day 1. The cemetery is very quiet. I thought I liked loneliness, but this silence is something else. It feels like it's listening. I flipped through the pages quickly. As the writing progressed, it became distorted, the letters turning into claw marks. Day 45. I'm sure now that they are saying my name. The soil is breathing. I try to ignore them, but the shadows are no longer just in the corners. They are inside the mirror as well. When I reached the last page, my breath caught. At the very bottom, written in fresh ink, was Tis. Note, Mehmet has arrived. We were waiting for him. The face of the faceless one will be Mehmet's face. The notebook slipped from my hands. At that moment, something struck the window hard. Then another blow followed. The glass did not shatter, but that pale, sickly light outside began to seep inside. Behind the glass stood the faceless shadow. It was no longer just a silhouette. In the condensation on the window, I began to see my own face. But it was not my face, it was my face stretched like a mask, with empty eye sockets. A horror. In that moment, I understood. The cemetery was not pulling me in. I had already been a part of the cemetery. The door I had tried to escape through had never really existed. The clocks on the walls stopped. The air inside the hut began to smell like grave soil. Suddenly, the door of the hut swung wide open. I was certain I had locked it, but it flew open as if it had never existed at all. Not only the wind entered, but those thousands of whispers as well. They were no longer screaming. In unison, calmly, as if singing a lullaby, they said, "Welcome home, Mehmet." The concrete floor beneath my feet soft. The ground of the hut began to open like a freshly dug grave. I was being pulled downward towards that pitch-black darkness. The touch of my shoulder was far firmer this time. I did not turn around. I could not, because now I knew that behind me there was not. No one behind me, was everyone.